Hello there and welcome to Summer of Synths. A theme this year is how you build hardware synth setups that actually work. And in today's episode, I want us to explore how to build a hardware synth setup that actually works for creating music and not just 4-bar loops. So I've invited a very special guest. He's not only a YouTuber, a musician, he's actually an organ player, and he also has Synth YouTube's best voice. But before we give him a warm welcome, I just want to say a big thank you to Perfect Circuit. They have sponsored Summer of Synths. It's a store that sells everything you need in terms of synths, Eurorack, pedals, modular, all the good stuff, all the toys that we love. They have good prices. They also run sales often. They also do giveaways. And if you check the description of this video, there's links to all the gear that we talk about in today's episode. And if you buy something, it could just be a cable. You not only support my channel, but you support future Summer of Synths events. With all that being said, here is my good friend, Jameson Nathan Jones.
Best voices. Is he saying I sound like Billy Bob Thornton because I just don't hear it? Hi, I'm Nathan, and I make music as me, with tape loops and pianos and synthesizers and a pipe organ sometimes. My music tends to exist somewhere in the neoclassical and ambient genres, and more recently I started a YouTube channel in which I talk about synthesizers and my compositional process. But in spite of said YouTube channel, my focus is still very much on my music career and making music that I really want to make. So it's taken me a little bit of trial and error just to optimize the studio to still work for my music workflow and also be able to accommodate doing videos.
I think that one of the things that people find most complicated is how everything is connected in your studio. So could you run us through how all the pieces of gear are connected and just how you make them work together?
My setup has definitely changed over the years, but most recently I've developed a system of what I call sort of creative stations. These are basically creative areas that are pre-cabled, ready to go around my studio where I can set 1 or 2 pieces of gear and just explore those. But at the same time, I need to be able to have the flexibility to pick and choose what things I want and swap things out with relative ease. And the main hub for all of this is my patch bay, which has become kind of the integral part of what makes my studio work and allows me to kind of rearrange the signal paths on the fly. From the patch bay, I can patch basically anything into my audio interface, which of course goes directly into my computer and into Ableton Live. Since not everything is always hardwired in and ready to go, I kind of have to choose my palette beforehand and kind of plan things out ahead of time. While at first this seemed like a little bit of an annoyance, it actually began to make me realize that I had too many options before. When everything was plugged in at once, I was overwhelmed by choices. And this workflow actually encourages me to just pick 1 or 2 things and go really deep with those 2 things, rather than just kind of skating across the surface and doing the stuff that I know how to do with all of it.
Another question that I have, and I see this posted a lot online when somebody shows off their synth setup, is how do you actually make music with it? How do you go from like a 4-bar loop into something that is more of a song or a proper arrangement?
My tracks themselves typically start one of 2 ways, either with me starting with a synth patch or a bit of sound design that inspires me and building around that, or with me sketching the initial ideas down old school with a pencil and staff paper actually. Then fleshing out the core ideas once the core ideas are really well developed, which is actually one of the things that I preach on my channel. The better you make the core idea, the less you have to do to it. Everything else just kind of becomes decoration. recording, I almost always ultimately end up in a DAW. I use Ableton for my solo projects and Cubase when I have to score a picture. Even though I'll often record things to tape, especially on my own solo stuff, just for the extra character and the fact that it kind of locks things into place where I can't be constantly fiddling with them later.
Another thing that I wanted to ask you is, what was the biggest obstacle that you had to overcome in order to make your synth setup work for you and not against you?
When I first moved into this house and decided to put the studio in a third-story loft, I knew that I was going to have to come up with some kind of system where I could still incorporate my piano, which is downstairs. I have not been able to get it up the tiny spiral staircase. And that's really what kind of led me to this more modular style of workflow, where I have to choose things and sometimes take them downstairs to the piano. Stuff has to be able to be moved around relatively easily, and if everything's wired in at all times, it's really a pain to do that. The main drawback with this workflow is that it has made scoring projects a little bit more difficult in the sense that I don't always have everything at my fingertips at all times. But considering a lot of times I just do a lot of sampling for those types of projects, I kind of have all of those sounds in my DAW that I can use for rewrites or whatever needs to happen. So even with those types of projects, it's really just forced me to plan more carefully on the front end and not always reach for the same box of tricks over and over. And I've also really found that this technique of just going really deep with one or two things just helps me learn the stuff that I have. And it is, despite what you might be noticing, that I have a lot of synthesizers, it has really cut down on the sense of gas that I get when something new comes out, because I know that there's stuff in here that I haven't even reached the full potential of yet.
Another thing that I'm super curious about, and I think is often overlooked, is the pieces of gear that didn't work for you. Because we do tend to talk about the stuff that works for us, that makes us more creative, that are more fun. But on the path to figuring all of that out, there must have been many pieces of gear that just didn't work for you. So could you talk a little bit about that, about gear that didn't work for you?
Funny that you should mention that. This might be a bit controversial from someone who does do some DAW-less stuff, whatever that means. I come from a more classical background. I am a classically trained pianist first and foremost, and because of that, and my compositional training being in that vein as well, I tend to think more linearly instead of just stacking loops all the time, or in groups of 16-step sequences. Over the years, I've tried multiple groove boxes or hardware samplers, and I've just never quite gotten along with them the way that I thought that I would. And while I create things with them that I actually think are pretty interesting at the time, I have a hard time developing that into anything else. So I typically prefer the flexibility of a DAW, and I have yet to find a hardware sampler that has really fit into my workflow the way that I've envisioned. It's just really hard to beat a DAW when it comes to trial and error in the arrangement process, which is an important part of the compositional process, I think.
And lastly, to end on a positive note, could you talk a little bit about one piece of gear that you couldn't live without in your setup and why?
Well, honestly, I would like to think that I could live without all of this stuff. Maybe just my piano and something to record it with. But I do have a very strong love for the electronic side of things, and I think if I had to keep just one thing, it would probably be the Sequential Pro 3. It's not only a great sounding go-to mono synth with paraphonic capabilities, but it's also kind of like having a modular system in a box because of the flexibility of the mod routings. It also has a really flexible built-in sequencer, which I love to use to modulate various parameters. And that makes it an incredibly powerful sound design tool as well. And beyond that, to get everything working together, as I mentioned before, really the patch bay, I guess, is one of the most important things in the studio. It sort of opened up the possibilities of having this type of workflow for me, and it still being something that was inspiring and not cumbersome to use. In fact, it seems like there was a YouTube video that I watched about the power of patch bays.
Types of patch bays are there. So let's start by making sense of patch bays. There are three configurations that are
Probably loop
very
pop.
common. They're called normalized, half normalized, and through.
I'd like to say thanks to Bo for allowing me to borrow his audience for a short time and giving us the opportunity to do this. I hope you got something out of it that can be applied to your own studio and workflow, and maybe just a different way of thinking about things. And as always, I don't have a catchphrase.
Thank you so much, Jameson, for informing us about how your synth setup works, and I hope that you, the audience, got something out of it. If you want to support Summer of Synths, be sure to check his socials out. Go and subscribe, like, follow him on social media, and also check out today's sponsor, Perfect Circuit. I've linked all the gear we talked about in today's episode in the description. And if you buy something, you support not only BoBeats, but you support future Summer of Synths events. So I hope you all have a great summer. Talk to you later.